Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to this third video in a series of videos on the history of the English language. And this time we're focusing on the early modern English period. So let's get started. We're sort of leaving behind the Middle Ages now and slowly moving into the modern age. But let's just begin with a quick overview again. So we've so far covered the Old English period, which led up to the 12th century. And then in the second video, the Middle English period, which brought us up until the year 1500 roughly. And now the early modern English period will cover the time from about 1500 until about 1700. So those 200 years is what we're going to focus on in this video. As another little reminder, what have we gone through so far? Just to repeat some of the milestones through time. So in the Anglo-Saxon time, the Anglo-Saxon period itself begins, or the Old English period as we can call it, begins with the Germanic conquest of the British Isles in the middle of the 5th century AD. Then I mentioned the Christianization, which means that from this time on, the Anglo-Saxons start writing down their language, which gives us actual, verifiable Old English sources. Then I mentioned the Viking Age beginning around the year 800 AD, which means that from this time on, we have an influence from the Old Norse language that the settlers who had come from Scandinavia spoke in the north of England. Then, of course, last video, we focused a lot on the Norman conquest of England in the year 1066, which means that, well, in the long run, this was one of the major contributing factors to a lot of influence from the Old French language on the Middle English language. Right, then in post-conquest England, some more milestones were mentioned in the second video. For example, the fact that after about 100 years, written English started to become a thing again. It started to re-emerge. We looked at one of the earliest texts, or even the earliest text in Middle English, namely an excerpt from the Peterborough Chronicle. And then shortly after 1200 is when Normandy got lost to the English crown. And this was sort of the first step in a steady decline of the use of French in medieval England. Other factors, of course, contributed to this loss of French, like the 100 Years' War. Another little milestone that we looked at was the middle of the 14th century when the Black Death happened or came to England and killed off a huge percentage of the population of the time. And this in turn also strengthened the position of English in the long run. Okay, this brings us up until the end of the Middle Ages now. And as we move into the modern time, you should think of the early modern period, particularly of the 16th century, as the age of the Reformation. That probably rings a bell or two. You should think of this time as the age of the Renaissance that was going on a bit earlier, actually, starting in Europe and then moving to England, influencing English writers as well. You should think of this time as the beginnings of humanism, of the secularization of education, and of a time in which literacy became far more common than it had ever been before. Just a quick run through some of the political leaders of the time who also give their names to the sub-periods within the early modern English time. First of all, we have, or the first maybe important figure that we should mention is Henry VIII, who ruled in the first half of the 16th century. So these were Tudor times. This was the time when England officially became Protestant, and many of you may know the story of how England became Protestant, became a Protestant country. It was actually sparked by Henry VIII's decision to divorce his wife which he couldn't do as a Catholic. So setting up basically his own church, the Church of England, then gave him the chance to, or gave him the possibility to divorce his wife. Then one thing that should be mentioned here is the dissolution of the medieval monasteries under Henry VIII. So this is kind of a symbolic, but also a not so symbolic, but really literal end of the Middle Ages, end of the text transmission as we've come to know it through the Middle Ages. Through the Act of Supremacy, there were actually two acts of supremacy for some reason. The king was firmly established, the king or queen was firmly established as the head of the Church of England. Basically getting rid of the Pope, and even maybe making the position of the English archbishops less important than it had been earlier. Yeah, this was a time in which religion and politics, or the church and the state, were actually separating, generally speaking, right? So this is kind of an interesting thing to point out here, that the king is now the head of the Church of England. Right, moving on a little bit, we have the Elizabethan time, or the Elizabethan age, which is roughly the second half of the 16th century. So Queen Elizabeth I ruled for a very long time. This has come to be known as sort of a golden age for various different reasons. It was an age of relative peace, politically speaking, relative peace. It was an age in which a lot of famous poetry, famous drama, and even some prose texts were written in English. So it's a sort of also a golden age for English literature for various reasons. After the Elizabethan age, we have the Jacobean age, named after James I, King James I. Basically, the first quarter of the 17th century is the Jacobean age. In this time, we find the first, or we can say the beginnings of colonialism, with the East India Trading Company having been founded, and also maybe more famously, or just as famously, the first successful American colony by English-speaking people, namely Jamestown, Virginia, which was founded in 1607. Also, the King James Bible, very, very famous document from this time, named after King James, not because he himself wrote it, of course, but because the translators that created the King James Bible were working in this time, and of course with the blessing of the king. This is also the time in which we find things like the Gunpowder Plot, very famous as well, also known as the Jesuit treason, Guy Fawkes, the 5th of November, and so on. So people were trying to blow up the Houses of Parliament and the Old Bailey Court and other important buildings in London, but that failed. Okay, I'm just going to leave it at that right now. The early modern English runs on a bit longer until the end of the 17th century, and there's other important things that take place in the 17th century then, of course. But just to name a few, or the three most important rulers of the time, so you have an idea, okay, Elizabethan age, Jacobean age, what does that mean? Returning to our main topic of linguistics and internal language history now. The early modern English period has been called a period of tremendous political, economic, technological, and social change. For our purposes, maybe we can try to keep this in mind. At the beginning of the period, around 1500, English was still used almost exclusively for low purposes, as we will call them here, and there was no standardized form yet of the English language, which means everybody was writing, spelling English, using their own regional pronunciations, their own dialect terms, and so on. At the end of the period, by contrast, so in 1700, English had taken over the high functions previously fulfilled by Latin and French. In other words, English was now used by the government. It had become an important language in religion, in science, and so on. There now was a written standard form of English, and English had become a self-conscious language. And we'll see what that means in a few minutes. The first spelling books were appearing, first grammars, first dictionaries were being written, and so on. Okay, slowly moving to the first topic, the first big topic of standardization. So the standardization of the English language. The first thing to be said is that after 1430, there seems to have been almost something like a forerunner to Standard English. And this is what we find in the London chanceries at the time. So this Chancery English was a written variety of English in which there tended to be relatively little variation in the spellings. If you recall the last video and Middle English, you might recall the fact that there were hundreds of different ways sometimes to spell the same word in the Middle Ages. And this number was kept to a minimum by the scribes working at the London chanceries in the early 15th century. So they were trying to more or less standardize, and you can't really say that, but they were trying to stick to always spelling the same words in the same way. This Chancery English variety was mostly based on Southern English usage, with only some Northern English features coming in there as well. In the 1470s, the printing press, which had earlier been invented by Johannes Gutenberg famously, was then brought to England, and he set up his own printing press in 1476 in Westminster, which is close to London. Nowadays, it's basically in London. It's a part of London today. Chancery English then may have functioned as sort of a basis for Caxton's first printed English. At least this is what some sources say. Not everybody thinks this is necessarily true, but whether it's true or not doesn't really matter too much here. Just maybe keep in mind Chancery English was about a generation before Caxton. This was already sort of a form of written English which tended to have relatively little variation. And then Caxton, of course, in his first printed works was also trying to always use the same spellings, but this wasn't always easy for him. And we'll see that in a few minutes, what this means. London itself was becoming the most important place in England, so to speak. It was the center of trade and commerce at the time. And Neverleinen even says London was becoming sort of the hub of activity in early modern England. It was the fastest growing city. And there were several reasons for this. One reason I already mentioned, trade. A lot of people coming through the River Thames, with their ships, buying and selling a lot of stuff in London. But also the nearby universities of Oxford and Cambridge played a huge role in strengthening this variety of English. A lot of people were sending their kids or going to London or to Oxford or to Cambridge for various different reasons. And so this general region played the most important role in what was to come. There's a very famous passage, actually, by George Puttenham in his book, The Art of English Poesy, which is quoted, for example, on page 30 in Neverleinen. I just wanted to show you the original here. If you look into the fourth line there, that's where the very, very famous sentence begins. Art of English Poesy. So he's writing a book for people wanting to write poetry in English, and sort of, acting sort of like a coach, telling them how to use the English language in poetry. And here he says, if you look at line 4 here, ye shall therefore take the usual speech of the court, and that of London, and the shires lying about London within 60 miles, and not much above. Okay, this is the kind of sort of the most famous sentence there, where somebody from the early modern time is actually telling people, look, if you want to write English poetry, you should try to sound like somebody who is from London or who doesn't live too far away from London. Okay, I just mentioned William Caxton and the fact that it wasn't always so easy for him to decide how to spell a word. In the city of Westminster in his first printed works. He actually writes an anecdote about this, which is quite entertaining to read. So I'm just going to read that out, like I just did the Puttenham quote, sort of using the reconstructed pronunciation, more or less, of the time. So William Caxton is writing something like this. That common English that is spoken in one shire varieth from another, in so much that in me days happened that certain merchants were in a ship in Thames. So certain merchants were on a ship on the river Thames for to have sailed over the sea into Zeeland. So they were going to the Netherlands. And for lack of wind, they tarried at the foreland and went to land for to refresh them. Okay, so there's no wind. They leave the boat. They get off the ship and go to land to get some refreshments. Okay, and one of them, named Sheffield a mercer, came into one house and asked for mete. So one of them comes into a house. He means a public house. One of them enters a pub and asks for food. And specially he asked after eggs. And the good wife answered that she could speak no French. Okay, so he's asking for eggs, and the lady who works there says that she can't speak French. And the merchant was angry, for he also could speak enough French, but would have had eggs, and she understood him not. And then at last another side, he would have eaten. Okay, so another person comes in and says, okay, orders Iren, whatever that is. Then the Godweave side, that she understood him well. Okay, so this appears to be just a variant form of the word for egg. So one of them, eggis, is actually a plural form coming from the north, having slightly different sounds there. And the other one is a more southern form, Iren. And this happens to be the form that this woman, this serving woman there, this waitress or whatever, is understanding. And the other one, she's not understanding. So she apparently is not from the north. Okay, which leads Caxton to write, Law, what shall the man in these days no write, eggs or iren? And by a man, he means himself, of course, right? So which spelling am I supposed to use now? Or which pronunciation even? Because these are kind of two different words, two different dialectal terms for the same thing. Okay, so it wasn't always easy, apparently. Let's go back to the Middle English dialects. As a reminder, for a minute here, we had Northern Middle English, West Midlands Middle English, East Midlands Middle English, Southern and Kentish Middle English. And there was no standard in the Middle English period. So the English of someone from the north, from the East Midlands, from the south, would have been very, very different from the English spoken anywhere else. This was now slowly changing. If we look at this map, Nevalainen sort of constructs this map which is supposed to tell us, okay, there still is something like Northern Early Modern English and Southern and Western and Eastern Early Modern English, yes, but there's also something that the people called the general dialect of English at the time, which seems to be this kind of supra-regional variety of English that is now emerging, most of all in London, but then also spreading to other areas, which is kind of interesting. So there's something non-regional about this new form of English that is now developing and becoming a thing, really, for the first time since ages. Which leads us to the idea of standardization itself. A standard language has been defined as a variety of a language that has minimal variation in form, maximal variation in function. What does that mean? Maximal variation in function means a standard language, a standardized language can be used for everything. You can do everything with it. It can fulfill every function. It's not, for example, just a spoken language. It's not just a language for, I don't know, poetry. You can also write scientific texts in it, for example. And minimal variation in form. What does this mean? It means that there should be only one way or very few ways to spell something, to say something, there should be sort of one correct grammar, and other forms are probably not so correct, are not really favored by the standard. Okay, and that's what we have in English today. We have if you think of the English language right now, we have maximal variation in function, which means we can say anything we want to say in any genre you can think of right now in English. And there's minimal variation in form. That means there's usually a correct way of spelling a word and not more than one correct way of spelling a word, for example. There's usually, if you think of differing grammars, maybe sometimes, then there's usually one way to put it grammatically that's really a little bit better, or that appears to be more standard, more according to the standard than the other grammar. You think of something like, I was here yesterday, or you were here, you was here, right? Something like that. We do have variation, of course, sometimes in language, but usually there's a tendency to say, okay, even if there's variation, one of them is the more correct, sort of. And that's what we have. This is a standardized, very, very standardized language that we're using right now. But this was a long process. And the process of standardization in general contains 4 or so aspects. And by the way, this is not necessarily a timeline. It doesn't begin somewhere and end somewhere, but all 4 aspects just play a role in the process of standardization. So what do we have? We have selection as an aspect. In our case, yes, well, the dialect area around London, which basically goes back to East Midlands, Middle English, but also some Southern features and some Northern features, not very many, but a few Northern features are also in Standard English today. But by and large, we can say the dialect area around London, East Midlands, Middle English is sort of the variety that was selected in most cases for most forms to become the norm. Of course, the selected variety also has to be accepted by the people using it then, right? Then functional expansion, linguistic elaboration, functional elaboration, there's different words for this, means that English has become a high language. It can fulfill all of the functions that only Latin used to be able to fulfill in the Middle Ages, for example. And linguistic elaboration, yeah, this also leads to the language itself changing a little bit. So we have lots of new borrowings in the case of English. We, for a time, had the ideal of copiousness, which means that the English language should be a copious language. It should have a big vocabulary. It should have many, many words. This also led to the inkhorn terms debate that we're going to hear a little tiny bit about later. And then lastly, there's also this, in the process of standardization, there's also something called codification. And this is the aspect that says, well, if we are to have a standard language, there must be some way of, for example, looking up what is the correct way of using the language. So in our case, we have the first spelling books, the first dictionaries, the first grammar books, and so on, coming up round about the early modern English period as well. Okay, highlighting one thing from the last slide, functional elaboration, linguistic elaboration. Well, English was used increasingly, for example, in the church now, more than it ever had been earlier. There were many new Bible translations, more than there had been in the Middle Ages, really. Even though in the late Middle Ages, you also had Bible translations, or partial Bible translations mostly. Now you also have things like the Book of Common Prayer for the newly founded Anglican Church, for example, appearing in English, of course. So English is playing a larger and larger role in spirituality, um, in the religion of the English people. English was also used increasingly in science. So, for example, records, the first principles of geometry is the first geometry book written in English. Yeah, just as a side note, if you have been to a Middle English course, you might remember Chaucer, for example, wrote a treatise on the astrolabe in English as well. So it's not like English had never been used in these functions. Of course, it had been used in these functions as well in the Middle Ages, but just not as regularly. Latin still was the predominant language, and this was now slowly changing in the modern age, in the early modern age. This led to the adoption of many Latin and Greek words into the English language, and also to the writing of English hard word dictionaries. So the first dictionaries that you get in the early modern time, you don't really get any dictionary in the modern sense. That is, you never get a complete work that tries to record every word that exists in English. That's what we think of as a dictionary today. But back then, they didn't have that. They had only these hard word dictionaries, which are more like glossaries. So yes, they were called dictionaries, but you would only find words in there that maybe not everybody understood. Okay. So, and this was, I guess, directly a result of having so many new words coming into the language from Latin and from ancient Greek. Actually, early modern English was a period of intense borrowing. So the little statistics you see here should nicely show you that round about the year 1600 is when there was the highest peak ever, really, in terms of how many new words are first recorded in writing in each decade. Okay, so the decades around 1600 were really a peak of borrowing new words from other languages. And the number one donor language was the Latin language, believe it or not. Today, we tend to associate the Latin language, I mean, being a long dead language, either with classical antiquity, which is when people still actually spoke Latin, Julius Caesar, for example, or maybe we tend to associate it with the Middle Ages, and that's true too. Latin was a very important language for international communication all throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern age. But now Latin was overtaking French as the number one language from which English was taking new vocabulary. And this is quite shocking, right? This is quite fascinating because Latin is already a long dead language at this time. In the history of English, Latin was always the language of a cultural elite, as Vezzosi says, a cultural elite who were not native speakers. So it's a purely written language, sort of a purely functional, a purely theoretical language in a way that people knew just from books. Words that are borrowed from Latin at any point in time tend to be technical terms, specialized vocabulary, written language associated, high register usage associated words. If we look at, here's a small list of early modern English loanwords from Latin. If you look through this list quickly, so we have circus, interior, medium, formula, folio, via, deficit, exit, veto, alibi, extra, verbatim, album, larva, and so on. You will see that some of these words actually are not really technical terms anymore. At least they don't really feel like technical terms anymore. They probably felt like technical terms at the time, but a word like exit, okay, that's become part of the general vocabulary of English today. Or a word like status or album, right? Or even a word like extra. Those are very, very down to earth, normal, everyday life words for us today, but they didn't feel like that at the time. They're just very old, so they've already been in the language now for 400 years, and so yeah, there's a high chance that some of these words at least will have sort of become normal words for us today over time. Okay, but not all of them, and Latin loan words do always tend to be technical terms and to only belong to specialized registers for the most part. Some people actually overdid it, and this was starting to get on people's nerves very early on. So maybe the most famous person writing about this was Sir Thomas Wilson in the 1550s already. He wrote another book telling people how to write good English, right? So this one's called The Art of Rhetoric. And in this book, he includes what he calls an inkhorn letter. This inkhorn letter runs on for several pages, and it really gives you a headache to read. So I'm just going to read you the very, very beginning using some reconstructed pronunciation. So he writes, pondering, expending, and revoluting with myself your ingent affability and ingenious capacity for mundane affairs, I cannot but celebrate and extol your magnifical dexterity above all other. For how could you have adapted such illustrate prerogative and dominical superiority if the fecundity of your ingenue had not been so fertile? Blah, blah, blah. And then at the very end of this long passage, he says, what wise man read in this letter will not take him for a very calf that made it in good earnest and thought by his inkpot terms to get good parsonage. Okay. In other words, if somebody writes like this, they're an idiot, right? They're trying to sound pompous and educated, but actually you don't really know what they're saying, and it just gives you a headache to read. So please don't write like this, is what he's trying to tell his readers. Okay, so we see from this little book by Wilson here that there was what I would call a new self-consciousness emerging about language at the time. So for the first time, you have contemporary comments on English grammar. People in the Middle Ages didn't do this. They didn't really describe the English language ever. You also have contemporary comments on pronunciation. They're trying to describe what English sounds sound like, which is really interesting. Also for us as linguists, of course. Also, the first descriptions of regional varieties. You never really had that. I mean, the regional varieties are all there in the Middle English age. You just open up any Middle English text, you have the regional variety right there. But it's just the medium that they're using. Here now you have people on the meta level talking about the English from the north, for example. Really trying to describe these varieties as varieties. Of course, these early sources, I just said they're very interesting, but they're also very problematic. There's a problem with early descriptions of pronunciation. That's very obvious. So there was no IPA yet. There was no standard way of noting down sounds yet. And so the descriptions of what English sounds like are always very impressionistic. And there's also a problem with early English grammars. And this is quite simply the fact that there already was an existing framework for writing grammars, namely Latin grammar. Grammars were usually about Latin, right? And not about English. But English was very different from Latin. So this means, or might mean, that there might be non-existent categories and contrasts made in the English language, or that relevant distinctions for English were not made in these grammars. For example, Latin had an inflected passive, right? English doesn't have anything like that. At the same time, English at this time already is starting to have something like a perfect aspect, a perfective aspect, which doesn't really occur in Latin, and so on. And so there's probably important categories in terms of language description that are overly emphasized or that are left out on the basis of what people were used to describing when they were describing the Latin language. Okay. English spellings were becoming standardized. Just to illustrate that a little tiny bit, here are some English spelling practices from the early modern time that since have changed. So you see this was still a process. Around 1650 or so, printed English already was using more or less fixed spellings, and only a few practices around this time were still different from today. But what is different about early modern English spelling? For one thing, you don't really have possessive S marked, so the genitive, so to speak, marked with an apostrophe. Okay, so if you said man's fate or something like that, if you said something like that, then man's wouldn't be spelled M-A-N apostrophe S, but simply M-A-N-S. Then I and J were used interchangeably. They were mostly spelled as an I and not as a J. So if you see a word like just, you would quite frequently just see I-U-S-T, which looks very strange to modern eyes. Also, the U and the V were still treated as being the same letter, which they are in the Latin alphabet. So they're still used more or less interchangeably. So what you often find, if you think of a word like love, for example, you will often see that spelled L-O-U-E instead of L-O-V-E in texts from the time. Another thing, and this is really weird, is that they were starting to contract ed, past tense or past participle of a verb. They were starting to spell that with apostrophe D. Okay. And for some reason, this got reversed later on. So nowadays, we're spelling a word like looked as L-O-O-K-E-D, even though that's not what we pronounce, right? We say looked. We don't say looked. This was a good invention, and for some reason, it just got reversed again after the early modern time. Yeah. Okay. So that's why I said this is really strange that we sort of reversed that again. So there was no possessive S with apostrophe yet, or it wasn't really used frequently. But contracted ed into apostrophe D, this was used very frequently. And then another tiny thing is that you have a CK in words like music, and you had different capitalization rules that I'm not going to go into right now. This is true for printed English after or still around 1650 or so. Letters and diaries, anything written by hand originally, still contained a lot more variation, a lot more than this, right? So you have spellings are all over the place, kind of like they were in the Middle English time, or you can sort of compare it with that a little bit more. So there was a lot more spelling variation in unprinted, unpublished works of the time. Okay, a tiny glance at pronunciation, because there was also, of course, a lot going on the level of pronunciation, but I have sort of left that out until now. So one thing, if we glance at early modern English vowels and how they probably were pronounced, you see you run into a problem here, because Shakespeare has a passage that is supposed to rhyme, and by modern standards, it doesn't rhyme, right? Gone, none, approve, love, here, where, said, made, don't rhyme in present day English. But all of these rhymes, all of these pairs of rhymes do work if you use the reconstructed Elizabethan pronunciation. So Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream, if I read this out the old-fashioned way using the Elizabethan pronunciation, then it would sound like this. Through the forest have I gone, but Athenian find I known, on whose eyes I might approve this flower's farce and staring love. Night and silence. Who is air? Weeds of Athens eateth where? This is he, my master said, despised the Athenian mad. And so on. So you see, these sounds were really different at the time. And one reason, maybe the most famous reason why some vowel sounds were still very different in the early modern time, is the great vowel shift. Just to briefly explain in a tiny nutshell right now what the great vowel shift means, it means that all 7 long vowels that were in the English language in the Middle English time have since shifted to a different position. And by and large, this different position is further up in the mouth, so the tongue is further up, so these vowels are now all a bit more closed than they used to be. And a number of them, actually the majority of them by now, have been diphthongized in addition to that. So all 7 of these Middle English long vowels, I'm just going to read out the vowels to you right now. All 7 of them were originally monophthongs. They were pure vowels. So E as in Riesen, Middle English. U as in mooth. E as in fate. O as in gos. Ä as in bam. A as in ston. And A as in name. Sorry. All 7 vowels have shifted to a different position, and a lot of them have become diphthongs in modern English. So that now, as you know, if you go to the very right here on this slide, you will see that we have rise, mouth, feet, goose, beam, stone, and name. And if you look very closely, feet, beam, that's the same vowel 2 times, right? So from these original 7 vowels, we now only have 6 different vowels. 2 of them fell together and became the same vowel, even in the long run. Okay, but in Shakespeare's time, in almost all of these cases, we still had a different vowel, and that's what makes Shakespeare's vowels, the early modern English 1600 vowels, sound so different. So if I read out these 7 words to you again, this time not using the Middle English pronunciation, but using the pronunciation that you see in the 1500 or 1600 column here, so the middle of this graph, then I would have to pronounce these words like this: rise, mouth, feet, goose, beam, stone, and name. So that's roughly how these 7 words would have sounded to William Shakespeare and his contemporaries. Okay, a lot of people have realized that in the early modern period, there's sort of this paradox going on with very divergent trends. On the one hand, you have a new language preserving trend, a conservative trend, embodied by the fact that we now have an ongoing standardization. So standardization means that spelling is becoming fixed, and if spellings become fixed, well, this means that they tend to be conservative, right? That 100 years later, maybe they are still using the same spellings, right? So this is a conservative force, a language preserving trend. And on the other hand, you also have these radical trends that are changing the language quite dramatically. So, for example, the ongoing sound changes, and the Great Vowel Shift is just one of many ongoing sound changes at the time. And another not conservative, but radical or language changing trend at the time is the already mentioned expansion of the vocabulary. The vocabulary of English is showing the fastest growth ever, with Latin being the #1 donor language. So if you compare these 2 things, we have spellings being conserved, being frozen sort of in time. And at the same time, we have ongoing sound changes. Well, this means that in the long run, after the early modern time, what happens is that English spellings tend to not refer to the pronunciations as closely as they used to anymore, but they rather refer to the pronunciations as they used to be before, or as the spellings got fixed, but before things like the Great Vowel Shift were completed yet, right? So that's why you have a huge divergence in English spellings today if you look at the way spelling relates to pronunciation in present-day English. Okay, so in a nutshell, from today's video, early modern English is the period in which English was taking over high functions previously associated mostly with Latin. So English was now being used in politics, in religion, and in science more than ever before. This was also the time in which the English language was entering a process of standardization, and maybe keep in mind selection, acceptance, expansion, elaboration, and codification as sort of the buzzwords here. This is also the time, or this means that the spellings are becoming more or less fixed, and this process was more or less completed, at least for printed English, by about 1650. The English lexicon, on the other hand, was showing a very fast growth around 1600, with Latin being the most common source for new early modern English words. And lastly, I also briefly mentioned the Great Vowel Shift as an example of some of the sound changes that were ongoing in this period. Okay, that's it from me today, and here are my sources.